Hello everybody, and thank you for participating to this debate that will deal during 2 hours with the question, what's sufficiency policy for a post-growth society? This debate takes place in a very particular context where the European countries are stuck in the middle of an energy crisis that forced them to implement certain drastic policies to reduce the energy demand and to prevent shortages. And because we know the energy use and the growth are going hand in hand, less energy threats the growth provisions. And even if we could keep the same quantity of energy in the system, the reduction of the global energy consumption seems to be something desirable considering the social and environmental impact of the massive consumption of fossil energies. So here the question we would like to answer to
say there is an element of dark. There's an element of dark humor within the report. Hopefully you can see that cartoon on the right. Essentially what that's really saying is, do we make those changes now or do we leave that to future generations? So in the report, we argue for emergency governance now, and we look at what that might mean. Firstly, what came through very loud and clear in the interviews we conducted is that this isn't just about policy. There is first and foremost a need to eliminate the vested interests that really sit behind all our governance systems and are felt to hold them hostage to their demands. Also, there is a real need for transparency to gain trust and for politicians to be in the position to make the right decisions. So in place of vested interests, we explore the idea of a ministry of investment that would oversee decisions and therefore be able to sort of arbitrate between departments. And when we say state of emergency, we mean something more than just declaring the existence of a climate emergency, even though we see that as a useful first step. A state of emergency would mean powers similar to those that the governments took on when they were dealing with COVID-19, and it means the ability to act and react quickly as needed. Now, we see that that would require a real mandate from the public, and also that that would need to be sustained over quite a long period of time. Therefore, we argue that there's a real need for broad participation through forms of direct democracy, such as citizens' assemblies and empowerment at the community level. Otherwise, the feeling is that that mandate just wouldn't be strong enough to make the changes necessary. We propose that disruption is inherent in change, but this can be done with planned support and a just transition in terms of jobs and supportive policies such as universal basic income and services, and also an insistence that the affluent share the burden. As part of emergency governance, our report found quite a common understanding that we do need to operate a post-growth economy. And I know that how we do that is a key part of the discussion coming up today. So just a few points from our report. Amongst the people we spoke to, there's a real consensus around targeting well-being within planetary boundaries, and that this being instead of the story of growth. And then also there is quite a consensus that post-growth economics is really one of redistribution. And as energy will be more limited, it basically needs to be shared in a fair way. And some examples of policies that could help with this, so I won't read it out, but the box on the right shows an idea around universal energy allowance. And we also talk about the potential for quotas on energy, and targeting extreme consumption by the elite in such a way that it ends up becoming antisocial and not something that's accepted in our future societies. Moving on to sufficiency policies, we use the model of avoid, shift, improve, and there's a real emphasis in the report on the avoid part. Reason for that being, firstly, that it can be done quickly. It does need consensus to do, but it can be done quickly. And if done, it actually avoids the need for as many of the shift and improve parts of the process. So for example, on avoid, this would be things like stopping airport expansion, banning private jets and domestic flights, phasing out cement making, and banning advertising of the goods and services that we really need to reduce or eliminate. In the report, we look at social practice theory, which is understanding essentially that individual behaviors are never isolated from the social structures that are in place. So that all needs to be addressed together. And we also look at examples of invisible energy policies. So, for example, building regulations require heating of buildings to being 18 to 22 degrees. So without that being directly an energy policy, it's having an obvious effect on energy usage. And an example there of how that can actually be changed really quite quickly is in August of this year, Spain, for example, introduced a law limiting warming and cooling. So these are things that can be changed. I won't talk about all the interventions in detail on this slide, but just to say that they include both stick and carrot type policies, and are on a spectrum ranging from those that require that are relatively easy to implement and don't require such a big mandate, through to those that are more radical and would need a bigger mandate. For example, implementing quotas through to outright bans. So what we found in the report, in the last part of our report, looks at narratives, and it's really key to link narratives with policies so that everything hangs together. And there's a need to move away from the dominant narrative that's in society at the moment, which is one of growth, and things like advertising, everything really all feed into that narrative of growth. So firstly, we believe there's a need to tell the truth as clearly as possible to avoid that narrative being co-opted and distorted. We need to trust people with reality, but then that also means that there needs to be a collective choice about the changes. So we propose using participatory processes, so that we can really talk about a narrative that is we and us. We suggest adopting a common language around humanity's place in the world as interdependent and intergenerational. And an example of conveying the right values is avoiding language that tends to financialize everything. We recognize that there'll be diverse audiences, so narratives do need to be differentiated and they do need to evolve in accordance with this. On the slide, you can see some quotes from some of our participants. I'll just give you a moment to see those. And then just to leave us with a final quote, which brings out the idea of metamorphosis being what we need. I hope this has been a helpful initial introduction to the report, and I look forward to the discussion. Okay, thanks, Sven.
Thank you very much, Nadine. Okay, to jump in the discussion now, I would like to begin with what I call the big picture. Post-growth is not the frame of the mainstream media and economists. We talk today more about recession when growth stop, or when we think that the growth is not going very well. So how we can differentiate the both, and how much are energy sufficiency and post-growth inseparable? I raised the question, for the first one that want to reply. And before that, I would like to precise that you can ask your question in the chat, and all along the debate, we will ask the question to the speakers. So please do it. We can have a very interactive and living dialogue. So, are energy sufficiency and post-growth paradigm inseparable? Leon Leuser.
Well, to start with the provocative statement, I would say you can definitely separate energy sufficiency policies from a post-growth discussion. by just introducing sufficiency policies, or policies that I would say go in the direction of sufficiency in a society, in an economy that is still growth dependent, based on growth. So I would say you could talk about energy sufficiency without mentioning post-growth discussions.
Yeah, Maruna and Yves, Maruna and Yves.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for this great report. It's something I've been waiting for a while, actually, because I think there is not a lot of discussion around energy demand, sufficiency, and post-growth policies. And I definitely think it's very much needed, because I agree on the one hand with what Leon said, that the one is not inherent, that like links to the other. I think it depends on how we define sufficiency per se. So if we talk about sufficiency that leads to cultural changes, new institutions, new policies that are not so growth obsessed, then of course sufficiency and demand management is a very core idea of post-growth economy.
Yeah, so maybe an insight from the work we've done in France. But first of all, thank you for this report. I mean, I'm really looking forward to read it in length, because I mean, I agreed with most of the key messages you gave us, and I very much liked also some of the quotes. So thank you. I mean, the way we have approached this discussion in France with our negawatt scenario was really energy focused, and I mean, we introduced sufficiency as part of a framework which is sufficiency, efficiency, and substitution to renewables, which is very close, although there are differences which would worth being discussed with the avoid, shift, improve framework that has mostly been used in the scientific literature. But our starting point was to say, okay, we need to address the issue of sustainability and sustainable pathways in a way that is fit with physical limits. And then we will discuss the economics. So we developed a whole modeling without introducing any economic signals. We just run a kind of ex post economic assessment to make sure that it makes sense. But I think this was very useful to dig into the potential of sufficiency, and also related to social issues, of course. I mean, through the donut principle, I mean, linking the idea of environmental limits and redistribution, and therefore social justice, was important. So, I mean, we only came to discussing economics later on. And when it comes to growth or post-growth, I mean, the only obvious thing we can say is the GDP as an indicator of economic evolution is just irrelevant to that discussion. And I mean, we also saw through the COVID-19 crisis, I mean, especially in France, what essential economic activities mean. And these are not those which weigh the more in the GDP. So what we need is to go back to the real relevance of energy services and services in a broader sense, and develop indicators that value the increase of useful and relevant services, and value the decrease of those that are consuming resources for useless or baseless uses.
Lacetil, Philippe Roman, you want to react?
Maybe just one word about you hear me? Yes. Well, post-growth sufficiency, I think they share the idea of questioning ends instead of putting too much emphasis on our means, and we tended to yes, to take economic growth or the increasing the size of the pie at the end in itself. And so I think it's good to have both the sufficiency debate and the post-growth debate developing at the same time, because they try to redirect the attention and the focus on what really matters. So I think it's a good thing. But I have the impression that to date, or maybe in the current debate around sufficiency, it's pretty much individualistic in focus, so maybe too narrow. And I think would be very useful to put more collective in it. So I'm sure that the report on demand is on this track, but to understand that sufficiency is not only about individual choices that are taken on a individualistic way. And so to think of sufficiency at a national, international level, but also as yes, more than just consumers, as citizens and as people taking part in political entities, etc. And this, and connecting with justice, the question of justice. So they are, in my current feeling about the debate, very important things to articulate to make the sufficiency debate fruitful.
Okay, question from the chat that is linked to my question. How to convincingly communicate such post-growth policy to business? Now energy reduction is perceived by business as great danger. Energy crisis and obligatory energy consumption reduction after Russia invasion on Ukraine is an example. Yves Marignac.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's been a lot of debate in France, like in any country, any European country, I think, in over the past few months about these issues. But I think the French situation is different, possibly because players like Negawatt have been advocating for sufficiency for such a long time. The French word being sobriety, which should not translate into sobriety, of course. I mean, sufficiency is a much better word in English. And we have, I mean, for instance, in June, we had a very remarkable op-ed by the CEOs of the three main energy companies, Total Energy, EDF, and Engie, who called for some sufficiency policies. And then during the summer, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who less than 2 years ago spoke of sufficiency as an Amish style way of life, which he very much disliked, said, okay, we need sufficiency policies. And the government published just a couple of weeks ago a whole sufficiency plan. The point is that this plan is only addressing short-term avoidance, like reducing temperature and heat in buildings and things like that. And there's nothing about structural sufficiency. And the government is remaining like stuck between two visions. I mean, on one hand, the Prime Minister says now we need, I mean, reducing consumption needs to become structural. But at the same time, a few months ago, French President said, okay, produce more is key to maintain welfare. So that, I mean, the contradiction is obvious, but linking those is very difficult. The way we see it in France, to answer the question, is that the current situation and the fact that key stakeholders, the government, big utilities, sees this idea of sufficiency, at least in a short-term policy, and put it on the agenda, is a real opportunity to discuss more structural sufficiency and try to tackle the issue of rethinking the economy and rethinking welfare, therefore thinking of something like like a post-growth economy based on the growing feeling that sufficiency is needed to resist, to be resilient to crises like the one we experience. So that's not a complete answer, but that's just a way forward based on our experience.
Leon Loiser.
Yeah, I mean, to add on this, like how to communicate post-growth or sufficiency policies to businesses. I mean, I think there's like different layers to this question. Like you can discuss this as Yves said right now in the current situation of crisis, and I would agree. Like I think that's like the key question, the key task for sufficiency actors to come forward now in this discussion, to take this window of opportunity to bring forward that sufficiency is not only a short-term measure, an emergency measure, but like required for a longer-term structural change if we want to achieve the European climate targets. And I think if you're talking to business actors, there's many, I think, at least I observed in Germany, there's also science on it, on post-growth companies, and they say like that there are many business actors. They say like, well, I don't want to grow anymore because like that's difficult for me, for my organization. I would completely restructure my organization. I like the status quo right now, and additionally to this, I would say that there are many businesses or business models that would need to be still developed for like to foster sufficiency, all about, like, for example, vegan products or vegetarian products, like milk alternatives. If you think about a multimodal transport, like applications where you can like Trafi, like from Lithuania, where you can like book your e-scooter, your car sharing car if you need it, and your train ticket, and you can see and compare how much it costs to come from A to B, because that's like what most of people want. They want to move from A to B, and they don't necessarily need a car for that. And if you can compare like the time that you need and how much it costs, I think that's already like a step forward. And like I would say you can even say like there are business models, business opportunities in the sufficiency area.
Nadine Storey?
Yeah, I think building on what Leon was saying there, I think this question about business is the fact that business is not homogenous. So, and we can't, there is a need to accept that, and not those businesses will resist. But that's the debate that will need to take place. But Leon is right that there are other types of business that may see an opportunity. So that's the sort of balance. It's not, business is not one thing. There are lots of different types of business, and there would be opportunities for some, but there would also definitely be other kinds of business that would need to completely change, pivot to something completely different, or to close down altogether.
How do you make the difference between recession and post-growth? It's really a question that I see very often. For a lot of people, an economy shrinking means less taxes for state, and it leads us to great danger. So how we can convince with the post-growth society, which implicate maybe or not sufficiency policies, how we can convince the people that only talk about recession and about the danger of recession? Marula?
Yeah, I think this issue has been discussed a lot recently with COVID. First of all, I think the most important thing is that we need to clarify that post-growth or degrowth, they're democratically decided and they are voluntarily. They're not forced upon us from like an economic, let's say, or free market point of view. So that is a very, very important distinction. And secondly, it's that post-growth economy is supposed to help the lower or middle class. While in a recession, these are the societal groups that are most often like hit from the recession and the economic crisis. So, I mean, what happened in COVID-19, it's not transition to post-growth economy per se, right? We see energy poverty right now hitting mostly the poor people, or you know, we see all these things that are not democratically decided, they're not voluntarily, and clearly have nothing to do with the post-growth economy. But what we did see is that we are able to react very fast if we want to. We can adapt our policies, we can take quick decisions in order to avoid catastrophe. So we see that we have this capacity to do it and the flexibility as a society, so we can decide to move to actual post-growth economy if we actually want to. So I think that is a very important takeaway from what we're facing right now and the COVID crisis.
Okay, another reaction? Leon Leuser?
Well, at least my strategy the past years was like to simply avoid the discussion about post-growth or degrowth, and to talk about like where we need to go, like the targets, the environmental targets, and like showing that with just the technical strategies of efficiency and renewable energies and circular economy, we will not achieve these targets. And then I think like Soaring Institute came forward on the European precautionary principle to think about post-growth. Okay, what, like, also in this line of thinking, we want to achieve our environmental targets, we need the sufficiency policies. This might have negative effects on our growth model, or might not be possible with the sustained economic growth. So we need to prepare for this, and then think about like how we need to change our institutions in case this happens. And I think this is a strategy to talk about it, like that might be like successful with policy actors, and also like from more business actors, because I think if we really come forward like with the targets, and the target is environmental targets, and it's not about like we want or we need post-growth or degrowth for the sake of degrowth. I mean, the idea is to achieve our environmental targets.
Lasse Thiele.
I think the decisive difference is, do you work towards structural change in economic relations, in property relations, in the way that basic goods are provided for citizens, or are you not willing to do that? To me, that's the difference between sort of pursuing kind of post-growth politics or just managing a recession. Because if you don't do that, then any sort of recession is obviously just going to mean austerity for the poor. So any kind of sort of post-growth handling of the situation now would have to move in that direction. And in Germany, I'm seeing very, very little of that. I don't know if I'm not so sure about other countries, but I think the general mood seems to be that that's quite similar in most European countries at the moment, or that those measures, where they exist, are rather marginal, or come in a package of measures that mostly still point in the direction of sort of maintaining a privatized economy. Yeah.
Yves Marignac.
To me, I mean, the discussion between growth and post-growth, it's kind of pointless if you don't dig into the indicators we're using. I mean, I already mentioned GDP, of course, but if you look at the power purchase, for instance, it's the same. The power purchase only includes, the financial capacity to buy goods and services. I mean, if you don't take into account the time you're spending to get access to this purchase, if you don't take into account all the valuable things we get access to without, I mean, without any price being involved. I mean, the indicators we are using to think about the economy are wrong from a sustainability and sufficiency perspective. So we just need to rethink it. I'm recently on in another roundtable on sufficiency in France. One friend of mine, orthodox economist, I would say, said, okay, we really got it wrong, or us, the mainstream economists, in the way we looked at some investments in the past years, investments such as collective transport infrastructures. He said if we simply include a posteriori an insurance cost in those investments, I mean, they were much more relevant than we thought and than we recommended. So what I mean, we simply need to take into account the and not only the environmental externalities, of course, which are I mean, there's a lot of scientific literature about it, but also social externalities. I mean, when you see that in a rich country like France with an abundant energy system with the nuclear fleet, we have more than 12% of people in energy poverty. I mean, there's a social externality that is untold and uncovered in prices. And we also need, with the current crisis, to think of geopolitical externalities. I mean, the dependency we are stuck in for importing fossil fuels as a social and an economic cost. So if you think of those externalities, and if you think of developing businesses which actually increase the ratio between, I mean, increase services while reducing resource consumption and reducing those externalities, then you can really pave the way forward for developing some economic activities. And I mean, Nadine was right. I mean, there's of course a need for sunrise policies for these new economics, but also I mean, the need for a political will to address sunset policies for those sectors which need to decline. And again, that is a strong call for more participative democracy and more governance to organize this. I think there was a question about planification in the chat. I mean, yeah, we don't need the old style of planification, but we need a much more democratic and decentralized but coordinated planification to organize all this change.
Okay, that's actually we move on with the second part of this debate, and we actually we can ask this question from the chat from Elodie Beflam, who work by the Studying Center from the Greens in Belgium. So she says, thank you for the report first, Nadine. And should we link this demand paradigm to an ecologist planification, as Yves-Marignac mentioned it, workforce and financial capital reoriented towards the transition in a rapid and planned manner? And if yes, how do we do this, since we have to first define the demand and then only we can start to plan? It will take time. And third point, because the public discourse on climate and energy security is so soft, do we have the momentum to switch to a demand paradigm?
Oh, you're back.
You can read you can read the question in the chat. But yeah, so should we choose more planification, ecological planification, because democratically it will be okay, can we do it democratically? Léon Leuser.
Well, I mean, having worked in France and in the Jacques Delors Institute and in Germany, I would say like it depends on the culture in the country where you're living and where you are acting, because in France I think it's much more common to talk about planification, while if you use the word planification in Germany, you put yourself just out of the discussion.
If Marignac, it needs a reply.
Yeah, well, yeah, planification is, I mean, yeah, it's in the 70s and 80s. I mean, when the, I mean, we had probably a much more centralized and kind of planified economy than many other European countries. So yeah, the word planification is not as negative in France than in other countries, but we definitely don't need that kind of planification. I mean, we don't need the central state to say, okay, this is where we're going and we're going to organize everything. We need some I mean, we need like local businesses, we need communities, we need people to I mean to take their share and to I mean, yeah, to step in. So what we need is some governance, some democratic processes which allow for setting the global vision and setting the balance of efforts and benefits in a very horizontal way. And then, I mean, the state, in my view, is only there to coordinate this, to make this consistent on the national level, and obviously, furthermore, the European and on the European level. But we need this to be horizontal. And I mean, when you ask whether we could do it through a democratic processes, I think we don't have choice. I mean, it's both the only way forward, because I don't see this happening without a lot more of local democracy. And it's also a goal in itself. If we talk about sustainability as a whole, I mean, democratic governance is part of the objectives we must set for ourselves. So I really don't see any other way forward. And coming back to the French situation, the way some technocrats are using this planification principle now to pretend that they could again organize change from Paris, I mean, it's a no-go. I mean, it doesn't work and it doesn't bring us to sufficiency and sustainability.
We just have been joined by Peter Sims and Jonathan Essex, now from the Town Hall of Dublin. Hello. So you are the co-authors of the report with Nadine Story.
Yeah, I was just going to briefly maybe comment on the planification question. And I think we would just say plan-led approach as opposed to market-led approach. And I would say that the whole problem we have of ever-increasing demand is because governance has left the market to decide what we need to build and what we need to consume and how often we throw it away. And I think very much we do need a plan-led approach. We need a plan-led approach in terms of a job creation centered investment plan rather than an infrastructure and buildings related investment strategy. So we need less investment, but more focused on jobs. But I think that the report that we've just launched today focuses on the need to combine that, so if you like, just transition of employment to a stronger focus on the governance needed to rethink energy demand or resource demand in more general terms across society, and that needs the government to take the lead rather than expecting businesses, individual businesses or market sectors to do that on their own.
No reaction? Okay, we can move on. Recently, like coming back on the post-growth paradigm, very, very recently, there is a study has been funded by the European Research Council for 10 million euro about about the question Can we find promising pathway for post-growth that will reconcile our well-being and the planetary boundaries? It seems that the European Union takes heed of the emergency. So that's also your impression. And so according to you, what's the most promising policies that could be implemented at the European scale? So what should be done to tomorrow at the European scale if Europe, if the European Commission really take heed on energy sufficiency and post-growth society? What should be done? Like what kind of policy? Marula.
Yeah, I can start throwing some ideas. As like the organization that I'm working on, Research and Degrowth, is also joining Brussels soon to discuss a little bit about these policies. So definitely the European Union is showing increased interest on post-growth. So I think some of the core policies that are also going to be proposed and discussed is, of course, and related with energy. The reduction of working hours, that I think is a very important policy, along with the basic care income that is being discussed a lot, for example, in Spain now. And then some other policies that, for example, is the taxing pollution or CO2 emissions, things that are being discussed but have not been strictly implemented yet. And of course, we can talk about what I think Nadine said in the initial presentation about some sectors like UVs or jets, like these industries that are like heavy polluters, promote a certain lifestyle that does not align so much with this idea of post-growth and how we can actually, let's say, punish these industries through heavier taxes, for example. So I believe that these will be the first policies that are going to be in the center of the post-growth discussion in the European Union. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else wants to add some.
Well, I would say I would completely agree with what Maruna said. And I think to go further, I mean, you have a lot of entry points for sufficiency in European directives. I think it's pretty broad where you could bring sufficiency ideas in. But one idea to mainstream sufficiency and energy sufficiency, which I would say is important, would be to require member states in their NECPs that they need to submit to the European Commission, which is the climate plans of the member states, that they have a sufficiency, energy sufficiency part in this NECPs, so that all member states need to think about, all ministries in the member states need to think about, well, what do we want to do for energy sufficiency? Which measures do we plan? And thereby, I think you can really bring it into in the EU more broadly. To add on this, we had this experience in Germany in 2016. There was a plan from the federal environmental ministry, which was selecting, I think, 20 cities or in Germany that were master plan cities aiming for 98% emissions reduction and halving their energy demand. And there they required all the cities to also develop sufficiency measures, and thereby the topic was quite more broadly discussed.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's obviously difficult to answer your question because I mean, there's a need to address all sectors, and I mean, I think it was the closing quote by Nadine from the report, which said we need to change everything. So I mean, the problem when we've been asked, especially in the context of the past weeks with the crisis and the sufficiency plan by the government to mean, by media or policymakers to point to like a single silver bullet sufficiency policy that would be a priority. I mean, we need to combine all the good ideas we have, but we need to frame them into a consistent narrative, and we need, to some extent, some time for that. We need to go through the participatory and democratic processes. So maybe one thing that could be said is that at least the first step, I mean, we need sufficiency when it comes to long-term and deep sustainability. We need it both in the very short term and in the very long term. In the very short term, we need it because we are wasting so much energy and so much resources that avoiding is really an easy way to reduce the pressure in the short term. We developed proposals with Negawatt for France on simple things that households or offices and local communities could do. We just went through the most obvious ones, and our estimate is that it could, if everyone that is able to do it. Of course, we don't ask people in energy poverty to reduce heating, but if everyone in capacity to do so would do it, that is likely to reduce by 30% the energy consumption of buildings in France. That just sets the level of potential with just short-term avoidance. And so we first need to do that. The more we do it, the more time we buy to address long-term and structural sufficiency, which is also needed. We need to completely change urban planning. We need to completely change mobility and so on. We need to shift, for instance, from the current model of car property as the basis for mobility. I mean, keeping that model and just shifting to electric cars won't avoid sustainability issues, but this takes time and this needs to be discussed. So first of all, let's address short-term avoidance potential and then set democratic processes to discuss structural changes and discuss how urban planning, mobility, and industrial businesses need to adapt to this new framework.
Thank you. Last, Thiele?
Yeah, well, to pick up on that, I think I agree, for example, that a reduction of the work week would be one of the key steps, but this, as well as other things like public housing or socialization of adequate and sort of ecologically planned housing. I find it a bit misleading, perhaps, to discuss that under the heading of policy, because it's just not something that, I mean, this has such far-reaching political, economic weight and consequences that it's not something that will be technocratically sort of administered, but I think the prerequisite would be in the case of the shorter work week for trade unions to begin putting that at the center of their agenda. This needs a much broader basis, and then of course it's a big question also of redistribution in terms of how much compensation do workers get for a shorter work week, and all of this. I think it's just on a whole different track from everything that can be sort of helpfully discussed as policy in the sense of something that a ministry or the European Commission could work out and put into some form of directive or regulation quickly, which is, I think, more suitable to the technical measures that Yves was just talking about.
Nadine Storey.
Yeah, just picking up on so going on what Yves was saying about, so we have this quote in our report about we need to change everything, and that's true. That came through very strongly from everyone we spoke to. But the other thing was that we need to start now. So we can't wait till we have a perfect vision of how things might be. We have to start now, and we have to start with the infrastructure that we already have. We can't be building new things. We need to start where we are. And also, I was interested in what Leon was saying about the German cities actually starting perhaps to talk about sufficiency policies, because what we have in the UK is cities, there's a bit of a trend of cities announcing a climate emergency, declaring that, but then not necessarily taking any particular steps, or they'll make a pledge to say they'll be at zero carbon by a certain date, but without anything behind that. But if those cities started following, perhaps I'd be interested in following up what those German cities are doing in terms of actually saying these are some specific sufficiency policies we'll implement, then we could actually get something to start happening. So I think that's really interesting.
Well, I mean,
Leon Leuser.
Yeah, I mean, it was like at that time for me quite optimistic, like that there was even just a discussion about sufficiency. So as you said, that it was like plans, and like most of the measures they proposed in these plans were like seen for the longer term. Even so, I would say that there are some cities which were a little bit like, I would say, front runners. Like most widely known, there's Zurich, where the sufficiency discussion is quite advanced, I would say. And then, like, I mean, I was working in the on climate issues in a small city in Germany for not really long time, because it's really like a hard job to get this through. It's like, I think you really need to like, yeah, a long-term vision. You need to like be strong, because like there's so many, like already in small measures, so much resistance to change. It doesn't need to be even like sufficiency. Like, I mean, I did not, I couldn't introduce recycling paper in the year 2022. And like, I think it's quite a deception, like what's really going on the ground, I would say.
Lassetil, you wanted to react?
Oh, sorry, I think that was the old raised hand that I didn't put down. I'll pass along.
All right. So I would like to move on in this debate, talking about the power relationships. So we know that any politics that need to be implemented will face people that disagree with this politic. On a big scale, there is right wings are rising in Europe. And I don't know if the grasp the sufficiency policies and post-growth reflection really seriously. So how can we avoid political polarization to allow a democratical change? So how do you see this question into the political arena? Yves Marignac?
Yeah, difficult question, of course. Again, from a French perspective, I think that although, I mean, the issue of how this like sufficiency mindset is framing the whole economy in a different way, and we need to discuss this kind of post-growth vision and especially in the French context, the link to social welfare, which is a very important feature of the political debate. But I mean, for the time being, we can't get there because there's strong reluctance with the idea of sufficiency, both from a social and a more conservative security perspective. I mean, the social perspective, I mean, it's very obvious with French trade unions, which are, I mean, rather leftist and very much keen on the old public service concept that has been very strong in France, and they see, I mean, sufficiency as a kind of an obstacle to increase of individual welfare, individual power purchase, and so on. So they see it as something which is not social, which relates to what I said about President Macron's comment on this very productivist view that the country needs to produce more as a condition to maintain social welfare. And I mean, we need to tackle this by showing that sufficiency means redistributing, that it comes with, I mean, in line, of course, with the donut economic concept, that addressing limits comes with reducing inequalities and therefore some social redistribution. That is one part of the discussion that is needed as a way forward. The other one is the link to security. And I mean, it's really painful, again, in the French context, to see how the current crisis, which is not only the European energy crisis, but also a specific French crisis due to the very low level of availability of the French nuclear fleet, to see that in that situation, a lot of political players call for even more nuclear, because they are stuck with the very old idea from the 70s that nuclear power is key for French independence. I mean, it was obvious all along that this didn't work. It's even more obvious today, and that those, I mean, the right wing and even more so the extreme, the far right, I mean, that they are opposed to any sufficiency concept, and that they can't see that reducing the use of resources that we don't have is key, is a key lever to increase our sovereignty and our security. I mean, it's really puzzling, but again, this is something we need to address. So the link with social welfare through redistribution, and the link with security through the reduced use, the reduced need of imported resources.
Thank you very much. Nadine Storé.
Yes, I think so. In our report, one thing that comes through really strongly is this need to build support, for that to be a very participative, very widely spread support, and that we need to basically build a narrative, build support that is counter to the right-wing story, and that would be, you can't kind of, tackling it head on doesn't really work. So it's a case of just building that up from the ground up, with the expectation that the public will see, especially those who are really being squeezed hard into poverty, that they will see that there is another story, there is another way that is more fair. And also people are starting, I think, to see the influences that go on behind governments. I think that's something that's coming through more. People are starting to see that. So it's a case of trying to take a more honest approach that has more integrity, that people can start to believe in.
Thank you. Marula? Zachary?
Yeah, I really like what the two previous speakers said, and I agree, just trying to do a little bit of backward thinking here. So, I mean, I think we do have some mechanism now in place that can allow for these democratic and participatory approaches in order to, let's say, bridge the differences. The citizens' assemblies that were mentioned, I think, are very good mechanisms that allow for this contact hypothesis, so bring people with very extreme different ideologies together in order to find common points. And I think from my own research, for example, energy communities is a very good mechanism that you see people, although their initial idea is, okay, we just want to be energy independent, we don't want to be energy, to have energy security, then they realize in the process that in order to do that, we need to reduce our consumption. For example, we need to manage our demand. So what I'm trying to say that there are some mechanisms in place. And the other thing that I also believe it's important, not only for energy policies, but broader, is this idea of like the social media and how are being used now. I see a lot of campaigns promoting this idea, mostly of efficiency, like green technologies, a lot of this rhetoric coming from big companies on Twitter or on LinkedIn. So I think we need to, like, let's say, take back and democratize again social media and try to use these platforms to open up in dialogue and as a contact point. And the last thing that I would like to bring is this idea that I've been thinking a lot recently, like voting for policies, not voting for parties, not voting for representatives. So I think this can also be a very interesting approach to discuss, because sufficiency can be an issue that in the end affect both the left and the right, the Republicans, and so I think voting for policies around these important issues, because at the end of the day, climate change is an issue that will affect us all. It's an issue that can bind us together. So yeah, this is an idea that I'm struggling along recently, and I'm wondering if it could be like implemented.
Thank you. Lassatil, you wanted to react, or is the
this
time? Yes,
this time it's accurate. Yeah, first of all, I wouldn't say, I mean, in a certain sense, I would say we'd need rather more polarization, in the sense that if we assume that redistribution is a core part of any sort of post-growth agenda, then that requires some sort of antagonistic perspective, and it requires sort of larger scale political organization that I think must be polarizing necessarily, because redistribution is always rejected by those who stand to lose. And then, of course, I mean, I guess you were talking about different kind of polarization that you're trying to avoid, and to avoid the wrong kind. I guess that one chance might be to emphasize the sort of the value of economic security as part of a post-growth platform, meaning security against the kinds of geopolitical and geoeconomic risks that people now experience very vividly, and in as part of a very globalized economy with a high dependence also on energy imports, etc. And I think there is room for a post-growth agenda to try to position itself as, in this sense, sort of reasonable, sober, modest, down to earth, etc., which is a position that is now occupied by growth-oriented liberals, or even right-wingers. And I think to try to take back that association and try to align it with the idea of sort of a realistic post-growth politics of social equality might be helpful in trying to overcome that polarization and sort of negative associations with post-growth politics.
Leon Loiser, could you say some words about what happened in Germany? Because since the Greens are the federal government, what's the political alliance that could give the opportunity of setting up of implementing sufficiency policies and post-growth society?
Well, I mean, it's difficult, I would say. It's difficult because first of all, there's like the liberal coalition partner who is like independently of its if it's sufficiency or not, just everything or almost everything which goes into a direction of reducing emissions, I would say. Then on the really like national political level, the discussion on sufficiency has not arrived at a point like as it is in France. Like we talk now in the crisis about Energiesparen, which is saving energy or energy conservation, but I think it has a different framing than energy sufficiency. And then like even just this energy saving discussion is brought forward just by the Greens, while the socialists and the liberals, they I think they try to avoid it or like try to let the Greens go into the trap and like then blame them if it doesn't work after the winter. And that's why I think I have the feeling that there's like much more discussion on supply side measures in Germany than, for example, in France. And like there's like yeah, I think it's more on a local level, as I explained before, that there's some groups trying to push for sufficiency. And my strategy, like that I adopted since years, and probably I can understand everyone criticizing me for maybe like watering down energy sufficiency, is like to really look at like concrete policies, like to look like to try to look on concrete measures that could be implemented that are linked to sufficiency, that you could say like that are moving us forward towards something kind of a sufficiency, or maybe like in the end post-growth society or economy. But like having lived in a small city, like where I was also the responsible for the climate issues, I mean, I can understand everyone there taking the car. I mean, everything is organized around car. I mean, everything is far. You have just like huge car ports, parkings around huge supermarkets, and everyone was surprised when I told them in the interview in the local media that I was just going by bike, and they were like, "And what? This is possible?" And I mean, yeah, and then like to look there in this concrete reality, like what can be done there to move towards sufficiency. I think that's the task what we are facing, and less, at least for my part, less to to look only on this bigger picture. I find it more promising to solve or try to solve this concrete issues. And I think this leads also the sufficiency discussion to sometimes, for me, new ideas, because I mean, living there, I just realized that there is all this infrastructure, all this car-centric infrastructure, but like how can we combine this infrastructure with more sufficiency lifestyles? You won't build railways like from these villages, from one village to another. But what would be needed would be, for example, on-demand public transport. Like there were people calling me by phone, telling me, "Well, there are now this new public buses, like huge buses, like traveling from A to B to all these villages, and I see them passing by with 5 people inside. This is not really like in the direction of climate change or like mitigating climate change." And I have to admit, I agree. Like if you have a bus like traveling once per hour, which is not really useful, from A to B, which is super huge, super oversized for 5 people, it's not a solution. Even so, it's like it was an advance for this region, for public transport.
Philippe Roman.
Thank you. Well, it's just to at some points and to build upon what was said so far. I think it's very hard to make this discussion completely apolitical or non-polarizing, because some level of this redistribution is, I think, unavoidable. But still, there is room to build upon ideas like more welfare, more quality of life, more security of welfare. And when you think about these research on growth imperatives and the idea of growth independence, it's also the idea that both growth is completely different from a recession, because in a recession, poor people and parts of the middle class, etc., they suffer from the situation. But in a post-growth world, you are partially shielded from the ups and downs of the macroeconomy, and so you are partially, well, maybe more secure regarding these volatility. And so you can, I think, make the point that if you target the biggest and the main growth imperatives that remain, I think, at the core of the system, like the relationship to profit, as Jennifer Hinton says, or just advertisement. It's always the same, but advertisement as a core driver of more and more and more consumption and production. And if you still target the things that sometimes are not a win-win, but a lose-lose game, so zero-sum game, you can make the point that, well, you both go to a post-growth world, and you also increase welfare and the capacity to secure welfare from, well, from different kinds of shocks.
Another reaction? A concrete example I would like to talk with you, the progressive pricing, which would be a very concrete policy to support the more fragile households, and which would be a way to reduce the energy demand for the high income households. Has an history, a political history in France that has been voted in the parliament, and the law has been also, if I will not tell the entire story, but the Council of State, the State Council has changed the law and empty the law, the substance of the law. I don't know if in Germany there is such a political struggle around this concrete proposal of progressive pricing. I know that in Belgium, the Greens also proposed that many years ago, and many people work on it, but at the end, we can't do it. And I heard many people saying, yeah, that's the good idea, but it's too complicated to do. So let's continue with the liberal state. So this policy, for example, could be done. The idea is good. Last till.
Well, at Conceptwerk, we've been pushing this throughout this year. That particular approach of progressive pricing, we see a renewed interest, definitely. We don't see necessarily a movement around it. But an interesting development definitely is that here, as in many other countries, the government is now moving towards at least a light version of it by saying we put a temporary a break, as they call it, on energy prices, or at least on sort of some basic amount for every household. So you could say that that is sort of an embryonic form of a two-level progressive pricing system, at least for some time. And the way it's being implemented now is far from ideal, because it basically measures the basic amount for every household on their previous consumption, so that larger households, wealthier households mostly, will benefit disproportionately. But I believe there is some potential in this, sort of, I think that might be an opening that's developing, because people for the first time now get to experience sort of this distinction between sort of basic energy need and extra consumption in a pricing scheme. And I hope that we can build on this to sort of push for a more for a longer term concept of progressive pricing around the time that the temporary measures are supposed to end, which is in the spring of 2024, the way it's planned now.
Thank you. Yves Marignac.
Yeah, progressive pricing is, it's an obvious way forward if we want to bring more social justice in access to energy services, and one could even consider the option of free access to a level of energy that fulfills real basic needs that we need if we want to President Hollande's mandate, which was, which was like denied constitutionality on the basis that it was introducing inequality towards the general law. I mean, the technical point was that it was about electricity, and we have a lot of electric heating in France, and we can't separate in bills the part that is specific electricity and the part that is electric heating, which means if you introduce progressive tariffs for electricity or progressive pricing, then you will put a lot of burden on people who have electric heating and can't change just because of, it's completely different from reducing your use of some equipment. So, this is just to show that shifting from the principle to an operational scheme is difficult, because in that field, like in any others, Nadine was referring to existing infrastructures that we need to work with. These existing infrastructures are not only the hardware one, but sometimes the software one, like pricing schemes and consumption schemes. So it's difficult, but clearly the current approach of the French government, which is highly reluctant to any kind of differentiation between consumers. Any kind, because that would, I don't know if that is an English word, stigmatization. Does it? Yeah. So they don't want to put specific pressure or specific blame on some categories of consumers, especially the rich, of course. So they just, the French government is just capping electricity pricing or oil, carburant, fuel for cars price for everyone. And they just add a kind of compensation for the poorest. And that the interesting thing is that there is an increasing concern in the population that this is not fair, that what the fair way would be to put increased economic burden on those who consume more, for just to put pressure on them shifting first. But conversely, some left-wing parties are just calling for policies which simply ask rich people to reduce their consumption by, emphasizing that this is the main part of the overconsumption problems. And this is, again, not felt as fair. Also, the global understanding is that everyone needs to do its share, but some needs to do more than others, and therefore some progressive pricing is needed to reflect that. But again, it's not as obvious to implement as it seems due to existing pricing infrastructures.
Yeah, if
Nadine
I may add.
Sorry, Nadine Storey first, ladies first.
Well, just to pick up on what Lasse and Eve were saying, that really does show some of the difficulties of actually implementing these kinds of policies. In our report, we chose to focus more on this idea of a universal energy allowance as perhaps a less controversial way of starting, of being fair, creating an element of fairness. I guess that doesn't mean to say you wouldn't also need at some point some progressive pricing, but as a first stage, it gets away from some of the politics around pricing. But I don't know, I wasn't sure whether Lasse, what you were talking about was in fact a kind of universal energy allowance scheme. But we certainly think that has some merit. It isn't something that has been explored in the UK so far, as far as I'm aware. Anyway, that was the point I wanted to make there.
Well, without knowing how your universal energy allowance scheme would really work in practice, I just to add on like what Eve said, like I was also looking a lot into progressive pricing in 2014 for my master thesis, and I made the experience that in practice, or in principle, it's a nice idea, but in practice, it's a horrible idea that requires an almost Orwellian surveillance state. Because I mean, how do you really want to define like the just or like a basic level of energy in a quite diverse society? I mean, me living with 4 people with my family in a city in a small flat, I have like electricity demand that's like way below like what's always shown in Germany in like energy advising as the average for one person household for electricity demand. So like with a 1 person electricity demand, I would have the incentive to increase even my energy or electricity demand if this would be the basic allowance, because I mean I don't have any incentive anymore to lower my energy demand. If I have a basic allowance, it's much higher, and I think if you want to get rid of this, then you would need to control everything, like and that's not really like an idea that I like.
So Lasse, Thilo, Yves Marignac, and Maruna, sorry.
Yeah, I realize this. I mean, we've discussed these difficulties a lot. Our idea basically rests on having a few factors like number of persons in a household, and in Germany there's the advantage that residential buildings need a certificate now, which has sort of basic information on basic energetic information on the building, which could be used to allocate the household in basic energy allowance, which is especially, of course, important for tenants who have no control over over the heating systems. This would not be a perfect system, but our stance here is that having something that approximates sort of a fair distribution of these allowances is much better than the pure market solution, and it also gets much closer, and it would be a lot more targeted than a lot of other regulations and social policies, which basically take a one-size-fits-all approach. So be careful to not to declare something like this impossible just because it does not fulfill a perfect idea of justice and equality, which is an impossible goal in any sort of public policy anyway. but yes, it would be some bureaucratic. There would be some bureaucratic effort involved in determining these. That's definitely true. Yeah.
Yves Marignac.
I mean,
Before you begin, we have like just to have in mind a question that say very linked to the discussion right now. There's the world carbon budget. I think this has to be the starting point to be fair with the energy demand of everyone. So that's also another proposition between energy allowance, progressive pricing. There is a carbon budget.
I mean, whether you develop a reasoning in terms of energy consumption or any other resource consumption, or in terms of carbon budget, I mean, the tricky issue is how you get from a global limitation to an individual one, or to an individual right. And I mean, but yeah, you really could look at this from very different perspectives. But I mean, in principle, I like the universal energy allowance concept, of course. But I mean, then either you regulate it in a very strict way, and then it is unequal in a sense, for the reason that Leon said. I mean, we're starting with different situations where the energy, the amount of actual resources we need to fulfill the same level of services is different, because we live in houses that are not as efficient than others, because we have different access to different mobility modes and so on. So if you apply it in a very strict way, it gets tricky because of for that reason. If you adopt a looser way to implement it, and then you say, okay, we put the same allowance or the same quota for everyone, but then people could exchange, or we cap this allowance, and then people could consume more buying on the market, then you actually favor those who have the purchasing capacity to buy others' quotas or to buy more on the market. And then you reinforce current inequalities in access to services. So, I mean, going from the principle to the fair implementation is complex. One way we have tried to address it in our work at Megawatt is the idea of consumption corridors. And we particularly introduced it because when we started working on the European level, I mean, we developed French scenarios where we look at population as a whole, and we don't have the modeling capacity to discuss differences in depending on different categories of people. So we look at the population average and trends in access to energy services. When we developed a project with partners in different countries to get to a European scenario, and it will be published starting end of this year and completely next year as the clever scenario, so you might look for this. We had some issues, for instance, with square meters per person. I mean, the average is completely different in European countries. So how do you deal with catching up with the average, and not even talking about catching up with the average within a country's population? And I mean, the way we try to deal with that is to discuss corridors. I mean, we, again, going back to democratic processes, we discuss with partners, and we use existing literature, and Leon was part of this work at some point. We use existing literature to set what the distant level of square meters per person, for instance, would be. And then we discuss how much we want the situation in different countries to converge towards that target and think about corridors. And I think that is possibly a way to deal with individual situations. I mean, if we set a global target on the national or European level and discuss current situations and discuss how people should try, how we should reduce inequalities of access to services compared to that target and try to get everyone within a corridor. That, again, is a kind of individual translation of the donut economy. And at least in scenarios, it makes sense. And we are convinced that this could also be the basis for a new set of policies in that field.
Marula Zakri?
Yes, I would like to go just a little bit back on the progressive pricing. Sure. And like bring some insight from my research. So I work with this like small island community, and the engineers install these demand side management devices. So they want to measure the consumption, and they also collect data about the income of the households. So they propose in the energy community, okay, so from the money we get from selling our electricity to the operator, we can actually support the most like low class households on the island, or the ones who cannot pay their electricity bill. And the response was like, no, we don't want that. That's discrimination. We don't want zero data, which brings me back to what Leon said. It's a small community, so they felt they will be stigmatized from their, like, if let's say the numbers of their income were going public, or, you know, there are all these things about surveillance and sharing data that I think are very tricky. So I am a little bit skeptical about this progressive pricing from what I've seen. They found it really unethical in the end, which is very, very surprising. And going back to the global level now, the carbon budget thing, again, I think there are like a lot of issues of inequality and a lot of uncertainties about where do we set, for example, the temperature limit, what happens with the nations that need to grow at the end of the day, how do we ensure a fair carbon budget allocation? So for me, I think I'm more fan of a carbon tax. That is a more straightforward policy, that we tax the high emitters. That could be a very good first step, I think, a very good first policy, before trying to go into complex systems that can be actually, let's say, maneuvered by big industries. So what I see now a little bit with the industries that I work with on CO2 electrolysis is that they say, oh yeah, you know what, we're going to emit CO2, but then we're going to capture it back and produce a new product. So this balances our carbon budget, and we're not emitters anymore. But yeah, but what happens with the historic emissions you've been having for years and years? So I think we need to be a bit careful when we try to simplify these complex systems, because we can fall into the trap of giving a get out of jail card to these industries or these nations that have polluted more than others in the past years.
So carbon taxes, that's the proposition.
Yeah, I think for me, carbon tax could be an easier implementing short-term policy and can be more efficient in short-term, yeah, compared to carbon budget.
Somebody will react, Leon Loiser.
I would agree with this. I just wanted to add, like, I mean, a carbon tax with a per capita redistribution, I would see as a measure that fits into sufficiency direction.
Somebody want Nadine Storey?
Yeah, just to make the point that yeah, I guess I accept that implementing these things is difficult, but I suppose what we have sort of tried to say in our report is these things are difficult, but it doesn't mean to say we don't need to do them. Yeah, just that we need to have some of these difficult conversations. And I think based on what I think it's Mikhail in the chat is saying about sort of global carbon budgets, I think that is a good place to start in terms of being really honest in each of our countries. What is a reasonable amount of energy that we can use? And that will be a lot less than what we have now. And it's kind of really getting people to take that on board and then figure out how do we, what is fairness and what does fairness mean to people in terms of how we distribute that. Yeah.
Thank you. If you wanted to say something.
No. I agree with that. I mean, it is very tricky, as I said, but I mean, we definitely need to address that issue. But maybe one dimension I could add is that it's not only about carbon budget or and emissions or energy or like fossil fuel consumption. I mean, they in our French scenario, we looked at the raw material footprint of the French economy throughout 2050, and we set a global rule for our scenario, which is that the cumulative consumption of, say, critical raw materials like copper, lithium, and others should not exceed the French population's share of existing proven reserves. I mean, for many materials, it's not that much of an issue, but for some like lithium, it clearly is. I mean, depending on a scenario where we to cover less distances and share them more and so on, and smaller cars. I mean, that could lead, that could stay below that limit that we set or get us over it, which I mean, just tells us that we need to think of these limitations in our strategies regarding all resources. And of course, this could and should also apply to land use and water, with a growing issue of water scarcity, for instance. So we need to be kind of systemic or holistic when thinking of our individual or local or local community or national budget over the use of all these common goods that are these resources.
So we checked the last question of the chat. I think the last from Jacqueline Fletcher. When it comes to the electrification of everything, it's not just about having a fair share of rare mineral resources, but also about the impact of mining and process on the environment, which is not really a question. But yeah, that's a fact. But Leon, you said it.
Yeah. That's just in line with what I mentioned about lithium.
Yeah. But Leon, you say
materials, and the more we go for electrification without, I mean, and like as a technical shift illusion, without addressing sufficiency of digital use, sufficiency of mobility, and so on, the more we just shift from one scarcity issue to another.
Okay. Another reaction. One problem with carbon taxes to critical resource taxes, that it's like giving a right to pollute, to exploit limited resources proportional to purchasing power, nor to equal shared rights on limited resources. And CO2 tax doesn't address the problem. Somebody want to react? Oh, yeah, sorry, Nadine, story.
Oh, I was still reacting to the previous point, I think, so I don't know if it's to this one, but it was, yeah, just saying that based on what Eve was saying, as if individual countries rush to electrification, in a way you could see that as just a grab on resources. And that we can't allow that to happen. We need to have certain limits and decide what is fair country by country. Otherwise, that actual process of shifting, which is why we think that avoid is more important to focus on than shift. As you shift, you actually just end up with even more inequality and even more of the problems, as someone's pointed out, with regard to mining and the destructive impacts that that has. So yeah.
Last Thilo?
I agree with the criticisms in the chat, and I believe that the carbon taxes can only ever be sort of a complementary measure, but I feel they're vastly overrated in terms of how central a climate justice policy, especially, they can be for precisely the reasons that are noted here. It just they do allow for sort of vastly unequal levels of consumption, unless there are other measures in place that then I guess would be the more interesting ones to turn to. And I always find it I always like to push back against the idea that a carbon tax is the central mechanism to sort of regulate emissions.
Mahula Zakiri. Did I pronounce it right? Yes, sorry.
Yeah. Just a brief follow-up. I agree that, of course, when we talk about carbon tax, I think it's like one string on the bow of like a broader degrowth or decarbonization strategy per se alone. It's not going to work, right? And I'm not saying it's the perfect strategy. Also, we miss the signal. What will be the right price, and how we can ensure that this is not heavily passed to the consumers. But I think my idea was then the comparison of carbon budget, global carbon budget, and carbon tax. Carbon tax at this point that we're standing as like global nations, and the emergence of climate change might be more easy to implement, faster and more efficient, but not alone, right? Because yeah, as it was mentioned, it can again be abused by certain actors that hold power, and I mean, will most probably do if we're not democratically owned and we have not control mechanisms and strong institutions in place to regulate this carbon tax. So yeah, just to clarify, I don't think alone carbon tax, and I don't think carbon tax is a sufficiency measure per se, right? It's just a part of a bigger policy umbrella.
Yeah, I would agree with Varuna. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's a central instrument, but yeah, it's one measure, and I would also always say it's only a measure if there is a redistribution mechanism combined with it, because without a redistribution mechanism, it's highly regressive and highly like reinforcing current inequalities. But also on the carbon pricing, a small anecdote from my ground experience. I had a energy event in this small city on housing renovation, and it's really like, it was like eye-opening how people reacted to a presentation where they saw, okay, if I reinstall a gas heating system, I have, I don't know, like 5,000 or 6,000 additional euros for the fuel in the next 5 or 10 years, which was presented. And if I have this other choice of a heat pump, I don't have these additional points, even though like the upfront cost might be higher. I think it gives a signal to private house owners, and like it gives a signal to the market that which choice to take. I think in the end, carbon pricing is also a utopia. Like a perfect carbon pricing system is also a utopia as a progressive pricing. Just compared to progressive pricing, I think in the current system it's easier to implement.
Thank you. We are now by the end of this meeting, so it should be great to learn. So maybe the last thought before we say goodbye, before we wish us a good afternoon. So maybe reaction to what has been said, or like to conclude.
I start
again.
and I start and I make it short. I think as sufficiency actors, our key task now should be to find ways how to use this window that we have now. That there is some discussion, in some countries more, some countries less. A discussion about demand reduction, managing demand, and like to think about ideal ways, and I think they can be locally or nationally different. What are ways to prolong this discussion? What are ways like to implement in current crisis situation structural or ask for structural changes? I think this should be our common task right now.
Thank you. Somebody else, yeah, Nadine Soaring. And then Yves Marignac.
Oh, I've just got a final thought, which is something we bring out in our report is about language. I'm very conscious today and that we all struggle not to use words and terminology that still is part of the current kind of narrative about growth and about financial things. And it's just something to reflect upon and think about how do we somehow all of us kind of shift our language in a way that moves people into a different way of thinking. So just a thought on that.
Maroulat Zakari. No, first Yves Marignac and Maroulat Zakari.
Okay, well, thanks for this very interesting discussion, first of all. I would get back to one of the starting point about metamorphosis. I think that sufficiency, I mean, the different dimensions which we could give to this sufficiency concept, I mean, just set the way for a complete change of paradigm in thinking social welfare, economy, access to resources, geopolitics, and that, I mean, it is what we need. I mean, we need a change of paradigm in thinking of all these issues to get to a real life metamorphosis. And I'm very much confident that we have all the bricks to do that, and we just need to get this together and overcome, of course, negative forces that exist and that oppose this change, mostly because they don't want the kind of redistribution that comes with it.
Thank you. Maroulat Zakari?
Yeah, a little bit on the same line, because yeah, as a final remark, sometimes I also leave these conversations feeling like, you know, this weight on, you know, everything is just so difficult to change, and how we can reverse the tide, and we're like heading toward a climate catastrophe, and there's nothing we can do. So I always like to close this discussion with something positive. And I have to say that if we look around us, we see so many initiatives that we can inspire from. And I think it said that earlier, that, you know, at local level or even in governments, we now have policies, we now have movements that are organizing, you know, towards sufficiency, but also towards post-growth economies. We have the Donut Initiative. We see reduction in working hours. We see municipalities creating public companies of energy. We do see things, and we need to focus on these, like, you know, just, let's say, take them all together and try to envision a new society and a new future. So no climate pessimism, but proactively working together and using all the power we have.
Thank you. Last word, last killer, Philippe Roman, before we say goodbye.
Yes. Well, I think that maybe time is ripe to, to discuss how to collectively set limitations, at what relevant level, with what kind of articulation across levels, about what, about wealth, about income, about wages, etc. In Belgium, there is kind of the beginning of a debate around the idea of limiting or capping incomes recently, but the debate has not spread out, so it's not a real democratic debate, I think. But still, if I judge from surveys in France, maybe also in Belgium, people are pretty open to these ideas of well, collectively as adults, agreeing upon limits. So I think it's possible to do that in a democratic way, but we still need to find the best way to do this.
Thank you very much.
I have nothing to add, but I thank everybody for the engaging discussion.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you everybody for having joined this discussion. I'm very happy also. We keep in touch because we create this podcast, making a montage, and you can share it also, of course, in your network. We will use, of course, this discussion to continue our work by Ethiopia, by Greenhouse Think Tank, and by all organizations. So again, thank you very much for this engaging conversation, and I hope to see you in reality and some other occasion. So thank you very much. Good bon appetit for them that didn't eat. And good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.